CHI is a nonprofit that's a global consultancy and research firm that's based in the United States in Boston. We want to develop successful, affordable housing financial ecosystems worldwide, and we do that mainly through consulting, but we also do that through research, through impact investment, and through education. What is affordable housing? Affordable housing is considered affordable when it costs less than 40% of household income. If we put together housing and transportation costs, because location is key when it comes to housing, it must not exceed 60% of income to be considered affordable. Housing can be made affordable by households in many different ways. Self-construction is one way of achieving that. Informality, very often when the formal market offers housing that's too expensive, is another way of achieving affordability. Rental can be one way to achieve affordability. The fact that families with members from several generations live together is a way to achieve affordability. And we can also have other forms of cohabitation when people who are not from the same family share housing to make it more affordable. Some people use their home as their workspace in order to decrease costs. And finally, housing can be made affordable when it is supported by government programs and interventions within the formal sector as well. At the Affordable Housing Institute, we analyze housing ecosystems worldwide using our own value chain analysis, which you can see here. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I would like to look at the housing value chain to try and identify the different items of housing costs that seem obvious at first from the housing value chain. So we have on one side the demand and on the other the supply, and both value chains must work well for the two to come together at the end and make offtake possible and households acquire housing. So on the demand side, you'll see we have eligibility of households to the housing, applications, subsidy, credit underwriting, loan closing, and funding, because the financing is an integral part of the housing value chain. Without housing finance, it's very difficult to access housing for households. And finally, loan servicing and enforcement. On the supply side, developers start with a piece of land that has no infrastructure. They bring in the trunk infrastructure, most often in partnership with the governments, the site layout, design, then there is risk assumption, construction, offtake, and sometimes management after the offtake. From these two value chains, we can already identify several components of housing, the biggest and most obvious being construction, with construction materials, labors, different levels of skills, transportation of materials, construction-related taxes, and so on. We have land, that's the main element we can't do without, with registration costs and other taxes on land property as well. Finance, both on the demand side and on the supply side, marketing and sales, infrastructure, management, and maintenance. In 2015 and 2016, the CAFE, the Center for Affordable Housing Finance in Africa, launched a study to look at housing costs across 16 different countries in Africa, with the objective to compare the costs across the continent, but also to understand the reasons behind the differences. For this study, the Center for Affordable Housing Finance in Africa used professional quantity surveyors. They looked at the main city in each country and the secondary city, and they used a standard house design so that the comparison could be possible, and a bill of quantities. I'm not going to go into too much detail of this study, but I want to look at the main conclusions of it to understand the components of housing costs. It used 400 cost elements, so it was quite detailed, grouped into 5 categories, which were land, infrastructure, construction, compliance, and other costs. And here on the map, you have the different countries that the studies looked at. It included Nigeria. So if you look at the CAFE graph here, you can see that the components vary within each country, but also that the total cost of housing can vary significantly, up to more than 100%. So cost variation is very large. The cheapest home that the study found across the 16 countries was in Dar es Salaam with a little above $26,000, and the most expensive was in Nairobi, Kenya, with $63,000. Construction costs are the largest component in all countries, with no exception. But there are great variations within construction costs. There are also great variations in land costs and infrastructure costs, and there are great variations within each cost category. If we want to expand that, we can think of other housing-related costs, because there is the cost of housing when you acquire it, and there is the cost of housing during its lifetime. So there is consumption of water, there is consumption of energy, and both of these can be can change not only based on how much the household consumes, but based on how the house was built in the first place. There is maintenance, property, and other housing-related taxes. If we want to expand this further, we can think that access to housing is an additional cost, and therefore transportation, especially with urban sprawl, can represent a significant cost when it comes to housing. I would like now to introduce the case of Morocco and what was done to make housing more affordable. There were several programs. It was not done in one program by the government. Some of them addressed the demand side, others addressed the supply side. One of them is called the Fogarim, which is a government guarantee to housing loans to people with low and irregular incomes. There were several housing programs with a price ceiling. The two most famous ones were capped at $25,000 approximately and $14,000. There were interventions to reduce the cost of land. So for instance, the government would sell land at a price that was below the market or symbolic to developers who would commit to building affordable housing. Other interventions to reduce the cost of land was to allow for higher density for some affordable housing programs, therefore reducing the cost of land on each individual unit. There were interventions to reduce the cost of construction, and these interventions were mostly market-driven or developer-driven, for instance, through standardization or through by respecting minimum standards set by the government only and not going beyond, because that was cheaper. There were significant tax exemptions, and access to finance was facilitated. As we saw earlier, finance can be a big component of the cost of housing. The government guarantee through the Fogarim allowed households that would otherwise not have access to formal housing finance to access it, because the loans were guaranteed by a government institution. The access to finance here does not mean that interest rates were cheaper, but without those loans, households would have had informal housing, which very often costs a lot more. Could there be any improvements to the case of Morocco? Yes. Accessibility could be one. Because of urban sprawl, households ended up having housing that looked affordable at first, but that required more transportation costs. Energy consumption and more energy efficient housing units could also be another improvement. So if we were to conclude on what interventions can be done to improve affordability of housing, the first lesson is that it must be adapted to each context. We saw that yes, construction costs are the largest, but within construction costs there are many things. And what causes construction costs to be high is not the same in one country and in others. Other costs can be significantly high, such as land in some countries and not others. So really the interventions must be adapted. Interventions must also address the specific components of a housing cost. It's important to investigate as well indirect causes of high costs that are not necessarily related to the housing sector. For instance, We did a study in the DRC, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and we observed that tariffs and duties were one of the causes of a high cost of construction materials. Transportation costs there also were very high because infrastructure was poor, and therefore it cost a lot of money to bring in the construction materials, even within country. The absence or lack of vocational training can also increase costs because then you have to bring in labor from another country. The availability of highly skilled labor can also be an issue, and an influence cost. Interventions must address the lifetime of the housing unit and not just the initial costs. Cheaper today can mean more expensive to use and more expensive to maintain. Therefore, it's important to look into the long term. And because when we look at cost, there always is a cost, but who bears the cost is a different question. When the housing unit is cheap today, it's most often the user and the household who ends up paying the high price in the long term. And interventions do not all depend on the private sector and do not all depend on the government, sometimes also on the household. So it's important that all stakeholders come together and look at the kind of interventions that can be done to decrease costs and improve affordability. It's important to keep the household at the center, again, because cheaper, yes, but to whom? For instance, the absence of infrastructure or having minimum infrastructure can reduce the cost, but it does increase the cost for the user, for the household who must compensate the poor quality of electricity with electric generators, for instance, or who must go long distances to get clean water. Thank you very much for your kind attention.